Hey, welcome to our second SQIP Salon in I think it's our fourth season actually of this virtual series. SQIP is the Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology, and we are a section of APA Division 5, Qualitative and Quantitative Methods. And those virtual salons have been a way for us to build community of qualitative researchers all over the world for the last couple of years specifically. If you want to join this community as a member, you can head over to squip.org to learn how to become a member. In today's roundtable session, we are very privileged to have a group of esteemed narrative scholars from various disciplines, and they will help us delve into the impact of narrative interpretations in shaping our perception of reality by offering theoretical, political, critical insight to explore both the inevitability and the potential risks associated with narratives in our times of uncertainty. Thank you so much for joining us virtually to be part of this roundtable discussion. Hanna Meritoja, Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of Turku in Finland, and Mark Freeman, Professor of Ethics and Society at the College of the Holy Cross, have recently co-edited a book with Oxford University Press on this topic. And each of today's roundtable participants has contributed a chapter to this work. Thus, I would say our discussion is not only an opportunity for us all to engage and ask questions, but also I would like to think of it as a portal to further explore through the written contributions after our this topic. I would also like to thank and welcome Corinne Squire and Molly Andrews from the Association of Narrative Research and Practice. Collaborating with them for this virtual salon has been a great pleasure. Before we start, I would like to mention some logistics, very briefly only, no worries. Please keep your microphones muted during the conversation and try to hold off on asking questions until the official Q&A portion, which will be, I would say, approximately the last 20-25 minutes of this event. And at that time, we invite you to type your questions in the chat for presenters to respond to. The session will be recorded and we will post it on our website in a few days. And now I'm happy to turn over the mic to you, Hanna. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I will try to share. I should be able to share, right? Yes. Okay. Can you see the slides? Can you see the slides? Yes, good. Okay. So, yeah, first of all, it's a great pleasure and honor to be here today, and lovely to see so many of you here meeting us virtually. And I would say a few words briefly here in the beginning about the book and its structure, and then each contributor will say a few words on their own chapter. So when we started this book project, it was in a certain cultural and political climate that seemed to be awash in seemingly incommensurable narratives. So President Trump had just been elected as the US president, and there was a lot of debate about post-truth politics. That was the context of starting this book project. It took quite a few years. So when we finished, it was in the spring when Putin had just launched his full-scale attack against Ukraine. And unfortunately, it seems like the urgency of these matters has not diminished at all. It's still very much very urgent issue, this issue of role of narratives in world politics, for example, right now, as we all know. So it seemed like it's important for narrative scholars to say something about how we see the importance of reflecting on narrative interpretation in, for example, in the context of post-truth politics, because it seemed like many people were blaming narrative for being complicit in the issue of post-truth, and we felt that we need to have reflection on the the inevitability of narrative interpretation. So our approach to narrative is it comes from narrative hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is theory of interpretation. So we suggest that narratives are practices of interpretation. So narratives are not only objects of interpretation, but they in fact are an important part of organizing our experiences and providing models of sense making, how we orient ourselves in the world, and so on. So narratives, this kind of perspective of narratives emphasizes the existential, ethical, and political aspects of narratives, how they shape our sense of our possibilities and how they are entangled in relationships of power, for example. And we wanted to emphasize the pertinence of the question of interpretation, not only for interdisciplinary narrative studies, but also for the broader debate that revolves around issues of truth, facts, and narrative. And in this volume, we also contribute to the discussion that is sometimes a bit polarized on whether narratives are good or bad for us. So we wanted to emphasize the importance of that we have to contextually evaluate narrative practices, emphasizing both the dangers of narrative, for example, in the context of the post-truth era, and also the potential of narratives, and we wanted to provide new ways of addressing the inevitability of interpretation. So this volume brings together a diverse range of research fields, including narrative psychology, literary studies, philosophy, social sciences, and narrative medicine, for example. And hopefully it provides conceptual tools to analyze narrative practices across disciplines. And next I will show the structure of the book. So it has 4 parts. The first part is called Politics of Storytelling. I have marked in bold all the names of those who are able to talk about their chapters today. So actually you can see that most of us are present today, which is great. And the second part is understanding the self. And then the third part deals with understanding the other, and the fourth part with narrative practices. And yes, I think it's best now to hand over to our speakers. We will follow the same order as this book, the same order in which the chapters appear in this book. So our first speaker will be Mark Freeman. You're welcome.
Thanks, Anna. And thanks to both the contributors to the volume. It's been great to have you all aboard this project. And also thanks to the many people who are sharing this time with us. My chapter, The Inevitability and Danger of Narrative, focuses on issues tied to what has sometimes been called the post-truth era, especially as manifested in the contemporary United States. The first section of the chapter, which I titled, What Have We Wrought?, begins somewhat defensively by trying to respond to a claim that has been offered by some critics that some of us interpretation, narrative, qualitative types are partly responsible for, quote, inspiring certain aspects of the post-truth era. I don't happen to buy the claim, but I do understand why it's been leveled. If, in fact, we believe that interpretation and narrative are inevitable when it comes to making sense of the world, and if, moreover, we also believe that there's no neutral place from which to arbitrate truth claims, then how, one might ask, can we legitimately say that some stories are flat out fictions or lies? So here's the dilemma, or at least one element of it. We can't possibly indict these fictions and falsehoods for what they are unless we have some working conception of what truth in the narrative domain is all about. Without this, all we can have is a war of competing narratives of exactly the sort we often see in the political realm. The second section of the chapter seeks to do some clarifying work in the face of the challenge. Rather than being an alleged cause of the relativistic nihilism that has emerged in the form of fake news, alternative facts, and so on, narrative hermeneutics, I suggest, may more appropriately be seen as an important vehicle for taking on the problem. This still sounds right to me, at least theoretically. But of course, the problems are far from over, not least because patently false though some narratives may be, they may nevertheless be held on to tightly and immovably. This is certainly one of narrative's prime dangers. They can be utterly impervious to change, to being modified. Hence the narrative impasses and standstills that have come to characterize so much of the political landscape in the United States, especially, but of course, well beyond its borders too, as has become tragically clear in the current Israeli-Palestinian context. The third section digs further into the problem at hand, focusing on what I've come to call narrative self-enclosure. And here I'm referring to, and I'm quoting from an earlier piece, the kind of dynamic wherein narrative loses its foothold in the real and becomes hermetically self-enclosed, such that one comes to live in a story world of one's own making. And it was in that piece in 2017, when Donald Trump ascended, so to speak, that the fear became most acute, because it seemed to me that authoritarianism was right there. The fact is, the problems go deep, very deep, and are about nothing less than the frayed fabric, especially of contemporary American culture. And the interpretive task of discerning what's going on and how it might adequately be addressed is an extremely daunting one. So here one might ask a SQIP-related question. How might one go about qualitative inquiry in a way that really gets to the heart, not just of individual persons, whose motives may be quite opaque to those persons themselves, but culture? What's required, I suggest, is what might be called a cultural hermeneutics of suspicion, one that moves beyond the surface stories so often circulated toward the deeper stories at work. Needless to say, it's a very tall order. And with that, I will pass the baton, so to speak, over to Colin Davis. Colin.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, my paper in the volume picks up on some of the issues from Mark's chapter, particularly in relation to the question of good and bad narratives, truthful and untrustworthy narratives. I come to this in part from a background in Holocaust studies, where the issue of which narratives you can trust, which are good narratives, which are bad narratives, is clearly an important one. At the center of the paper, I take a case study, which is taken from the time of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990. So Iraq invaded Kuwait, and at the time in the period when Western countries were trying to decide on what a suitable response should be, a body called the Congressional Human Rights Caucus held a hearing into what had happened, to investigate what had happened in Kuwait. The hearing culminates, the high point of the hearing is the testimony of a young girl called Naira. Naira is presented as a 15-year-old girl who was working as a volunteer nurse in Kuwait at the time of the invasion. And she presents, reading from a prepared paper, she presents a very emotional first-hand account of what she witnessed there. The most powerful and moving part of it, I think, is when she describes how Iraqi soldiers looting the hospital in which she was working turned out babies from newborn babies from incubators to steal the incubators, leaving them to die on what she calls on the cold floor. It's very emotional, it's a very powerful testimony. And I don't want to overstate its importance, but I think it's fair to say that it was part of a process that led to turning American public opinion in favor of armed action against Iraq at the time. The problem was that it slowly became clear that this was a false testimony, that Naira was not working in Iraq, was not in Kuwait at the time of the Iraqi invasion. She was not a nurse. She was, in fact, a member of the Kuwaiti royal family. Her father was the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. So this is a false testimony. It's now generally accepted as a false testimony. It is at the very best an exaggerated account of atrocities that occurred in Kuwait at the time. So the question then becomes, how do we as narrative scholars, how do we, the people who investigate narrative, tell the difference between a false narrative and a truthful narrative? This is a narrative which was powerful, which had impact, which changed public opinion, but which is now generally regarded as a false narrative. And in order to address this, rather than to answer it, in the final part of the paper, I turn to some of the classic texts of hermeneutics, notably Heidegger, Gadamer, Ricoeur, and the questions of what I take to be crucial questions that those thinkers pose to do with trust, suspicion, and dialogue. I don't, insofar as there is a conclusion to the paper, I don't answer the question of how we tell good narratives from bad narratives, but suggest that narrative hermeneutics, as it's currently being elaborated, at least provides a framework in which people working in narrative now can address these questions of how we tell apart truthful, trustworthy narratives from untrustworthy, unreliable narratives. And I guess that at the moment, in relation to what's happening in Ukraine and the Gaza Strip, this question of how we negotiate, how we respond to competing narratives of events is all the more relevant. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's my turn. So I start my chapter with an analysis of the post-truth debate, like also Mark and Colin before me. And I argue for a more nuanced approach to what is often seen as a narrative versus truth dichotomy. So often narratives lumped together with so-called postmodernism and relativism, and some commentators have suggested that we should move from subjectivism to objectivism. We should simply respect objective facts. But what I suggest is that instead we should move beyond this objectivism-subjectivism dichotomy and be aware of how we inevitably interpret and narrativize the world. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't be committed to truth, but it means that truth is intersubjectively negotiated. And what we consider facts are also part of interpretive and narrative webs of meaning. So I argue for contextual evaluation of narratives rather than trying to go or get rid of narratives. And a central concept in this chapter is hermeneutic awareness. And with this, I mean awareness of the interpretative resources that we use to make sense of the world. Such awareness is crucial to narrative agency. And with this concept, I mean our ability to navigate our narrative environments, make choices over what kind of narrative resources we use in making sense of our lives, and so on. In the latter part of my chapter, I analyzed the normative narratives linked to illness and use as an example how narratives of illness can diminish what I call our existential breathing space. For example, by disallowing certain kinds of emotional responses to news about serious illness. I here also reflect on my own experience of cancer, and I explore how the narrative of war and battle is used in the context of illnesses in problematic ways, because it positions patients as winners and losers and creates pressure to have a certain kind of mindset, as if that was crucial for survival. So these narratives create an illusion of control even though I suggest that it would sometimes be more important to have a sense of how we are all dependent on one another at various stages of our lives. So, so both in the context of the post-truth debate and in the context of illness narratives, I analyzed the existential, ethical and political aspects of narratives and suggest that what we need is awareness of the narrative practices that we are engaged in, rather than attempt to move beyond narratives. Okay, thank you. And then I think the next one is Jens.
Okay, Anna, thank you very much. Well, hermeneutics and hermeneutic inquiry didn't come out of nothing. They didn't fall from heaven. I think they draw on a broad philosophical tradition of thought, and our book, I believe, demonstrates this in, I think, all chapters, a tradition that gives center stage to the manifold forms of interpretive understanding, or verstehen. Now we speak of narrative hermeneutics, and as far as the study of narrative plays a central role in the overarching hermeneutic enterprise of understanding the human condition. What's more, the claim is that narrative itself works as a process of hermeneutic interpretation. In other words, narrative can be viewed as a hermeneutic endeavor in its own right. What this kind of narrative hermeneutics has to offer, in contrast with, say, other philosophical traditions of understanding or theories of knowledge and science, is, in a word, that it is sensitive to a particular type of experiential and existential complexity that is typical of human life. Call it human-centered or humanist sensitivity. This is evident in, I think, three fields of human experience. First, there is strong sensitivity to the cultural and historical existence of human individuals. Second, there is likewise advanced sensitivity to the particular temporal dimension of human life and experience, to the fact that we live in and with time. And third, there is a special sensitivity to humans' existential entanglement. That is to say, to the fact that humans can't escape asking fundamental questions regarding the sense and meaning of what they do and what they wish and what they hope for, which of course includes the cultural, historical, and temporal dimension of their being in the world. Whenever we touch this existential domain, we need narrative. Narrative is our most powerful way of meaning making. I'm not saying we should or we must use narrative and its world creative potentials, but I'm saying we do. We simply do, which is an empirical observation, not a statement of normative or ethical obligation. It is the awareness of these three types of sensitivity that is at the heart of the hermeneutic approach. It makes this approach not only a sophisticated sensorium of exploration, but also an essential part of the particular human-centered, or as I called it, humanist sensitivity of narrative hermeneutics. Thank you.
Go Molly.
Hello, everyone. Well, I just want to say, first of all, I'm really very indebted to Irene for bringing us together, and of course to Mark and Hannah for creating the idea of this book to begin with. And what I'm going to tell you in my brief time here is that the chapter that I was originally supposed to write for this book, I found that I couldn't write because of something that I was personally going through at that time, which is a story that some of you here will already be familiar with, but which was a story about being made redundant in the middle of the pandemic. And the wonderful colleagues and scholars that Mark and Hannah are, they suggested to me that I actually, in fact, write from that experience and to see if I had something to say about the use and abuse of stories. And so that is what my chapter attempted to do. Now, many narrative scholars, many people will be aware of the quote, supposedly, that Isaac Dinesen has said. All sorrows can be born if you put them into a story or tell a story about them. And the interesting thing is that Dinesen never said this, okay? She said something quite different, which if you want to see the actual quote, which is a bit elaborate and much more circumscribed, then you can see it in the chapter. But what for me was interesting was that Hannah Arendt was absolutely taken with this quote and used it no less than 3 times in critical places in her own writings. Okay, so she clearly felt that there was much in that, okay? And she argued time and again of why it was so important to try to put sorrow into storied form. And in fact, Arendt says of Dinesen, had she been able to stay in Africa, she would never have become a writer, okay? So that there is actually something to the very thing of trying to write through a sorrow. Well, Arendt's position really is summarized here. She says, you have to be loyal to the story, eternally and unswervingly loyal to the story. This means no less than be loyal to life. And she elaborates on that in Truth and Politics. Well, why was that important to me? Why did that speak to me at that particular point? Well, to put it bluntly, it was at a time when I was trying to decide whether or not I should appeal against this decision to make me redundant. I knew that it was not at all possible, not even a 1% chance that the decision would be overturned. And nonetheless, I spent many months during the pandemic accumulating 61 documents showing that what was being said about my case, in fact, was not true. And it was a very painful endeavor, and yet one for me, which was really important. And so I found the writing of this chapter extremely challenging on an emotional level, but also in its own way, yes, be loyal to the story. All of a sudden, when I had created this thing, these 61 documents, it really spoke to me in a very powerful way. So I'll just say here, so what can be said of these 61 documents? Taken together, did they represent truth? What was it exactly that I thought the documents and the connective tissue I wove between them demonstrated? I was both exhausted and very satisfied by this task, etc., etc. And so my chapter really is my attempt to try to use Arendt to help me to make sense of a very acute personal situation, and to try to think about, well, why is it important to try to bring together some sense of truthfulness in a situation that seems to lack it? So that's my chapter.
And the next one is Clive. Clive, you are muted. Clive, you are muted.
So you can't unmute yourself?
No. Should you try to go out of the meeting and come back or something? But maybe we can move on next and maybe try later.
Yeah, I think in the interest of time, let's move on and hope Clive can join us a little later. So with that, let's turn it over to Georgia.
Hi. So my essay takes up this question of false narratives in the sense of who is allowed to tell which stories. In the past several years, there have been many cases in the United States in which critics have claimed that a certain author or artist was not appropriate for telling the story that that artist or author was telling. And probably the most famous of these is the outcry against Dana Schutz's open coffin at I think it was 2017 Whitney Biennial, where Hannah Black claimed that it was not Dana Schutz's story to paint a painting of Emmett Till's mutilated body in his coffin. That this was something that only Black people could paint or write about. So obviously the background to that kind of demand is that white Europeans in particular have told stories about Indigenous people, Blacks, etc., that have been abusive and distorted. But the question I ask is whether we can criticize all, so the sort of idea is that you have to share the identity of the people that you're writing about or depicting. And so I have two questions about that. The first is, well, what do you mean by identity? Whose identity? Hannah Black, who originally raised this complaint, is an African British woman living in Germany. Dana Schutz is an American. So which identity is the identity that allows you to write about or depict these stories? So Dana Schutz said, well, I'm a mother and I related to this as a mother. So one question is, like, which of our many identities is the identity that we can consider appropriate if we're saying you have to share identities in order to write about or depict other people? But the presumption behind this identity idea in any way is that you have to share experience, so that if you have the same identity as somebody else, you share their experiences, or you come closer to sharing their experiences than others, and therefore you can write a truthful narrative about them. I turn to Gadamer's work to think about the opposite, which is that it's not sharing experiences that allow us to understand, but perhaps the fact that we don't share experiences at all. So Gadamer's notion of experience is that experience is always negative, that experience is something that draws you up, that surprises you. So we talk about having had an experience when something didn't go as we had planned. So I take this to say that the sort of idea that you hear a lot, that, oh, you have to empathize with other people and empathy is what's important here. It's actually, I think, maybe the opposite, that it's when you are taken up and surprised by the experiences of others that you can really tell a story about them, a kind of interesting, truthful story about them. So that if you look at some of the best movies that we have, say by Ang Lee, right, who said, well, what do I know about homosexual cowboys in Wyoming, when he was asked to direct Brokeback Mountain? Well, it's the very fact that he didn't have that experience, that he knew nothing about it, that allowed him to see things in there that others perhaps couldn't. So, so in a Gadamerean language, what this is all about is a fusion of horizons, where it's the very difference, it's the diversity of viewpoints that allows us to see new things and to understand new things. So I don't know whether Open Casket is a good painting or not a good painting, but the question of whether it's good or not has nothing to do with the identity or shared experiences, but with the ability to teach us something new. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. I think given that Clive is also talking about identity, it might make sense to return to him before going on to the others. So what do you think, Clive? Can we do it?
Can we?
All right.
Yay. Okay, thank you very much for bearing with me. Right, my research generally is about the narrative construction of identity. And when I was invited to contribute a chapter, it was initially going to be on transabled identity, the identity of people who seek and need a physical impairment. Though I requested to talk about other than human identity, because I think this pushes or helps me think about the limits of what can constitute a viable and a sustainable identity. So my research was on I report on other kin and therians. Other kin are those who identify with mythical or otherworldly or fantastical creatures, such as dragons and elves and the like, and therians who identify as this worldly creatures, wolves, dogs, whatever. And in the chapter, I look at basically just two forms of stories. Awakening stories, the stories that people tell, other than humans tell, about coming to the realization that they are other than human, and origin stories of how are they that way, and in terms of awakenings, the stories formed into the three types. The gradual ones of incrementally they realized there was something different about themselves and other humans, and navigated a way through the furry fandom and internet communities. Others were much more sort of a sudden awakening, what they call an alarm clock awakening, and others were saying it's more like a snooze alarm. You wake up, you doze, you wake up, you doze, sort of thing. And then they seek to explain that through creating origin stories. And amongst the participants, they talked about spiritual origin stories. Bodily they look human, they act in the human world, etc. But their soul is of another. They a dragon soul, for example, or a wolf soul. And these are either walk-ins where the soul inhabits a human body whose human soul has left, or they have been reincarnated as a human, their soul remaining either other kin or therian, but the body this time round being human, or that this human body, or the encapsulation in this human body, is part of an evolution, and at some point in the future they will be truly dragon, elf, whatever. Or materialist origins, that it's a psychological issue, psychoneurological thing, and they explain it in terms of that, or they create a whole story world in which they are here in this world, but are actually from another world, whether that in which being a unicorn or being an elf or being a dragon is just the way it is. Now, such stories sort of challenge for me the limits of what can be a viable or sustainable identity. For we have stories in the other kin literature about machine kin. There's one recorded that that this individual identifies as a sound mixing deck. Well, which raises a question for me is of how can one consciously experience being something that is not sentient? It just raises an issue there. The other thing it does that, other than human stories, they challenge the first order mimesis, where we sort of expect that stories about our identities relate to the real world, whatever that might be. But again, I think we all, to some extent, blur those boundaries between fact and fiction, and we learn about what are viable stories and how stories are told, not just from the real world, but also from our knowledge of fictive stories. So my final point is simply that perhaps we all make, other than human identity is created in ways pretty much the same as the rest of us. Thank you.
We had a request earlier from Jakob to be sure that he gets out in time to return to some other business. So I hope it's okay with Brian and Kaylee if we just skip for a moment, turn it over to Jakob, and then go back to you folks. And going forward, we're all going to try to keep it as close to 3 to 4 minutes as we can, so everybody has their say. Jakob.
Thank you, Mark. Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you. Well, my contribution to this book starts from the premise that not only do human beings interpret narratives, but that, as Hannah has argued convincingly, narratives themselves are forms of interpretation. A linked premise, or premise 2, is that, as Gadamer has shown, understanding isn't a merely reproductive activity, but also a productive activity. So, attempting to understand a literary or film and a film narrative, I build on the interpretive signals which my texts give me. In this chapter, I consider 1 literary and 2 film narratives. My discussion of the British author Ian McEwan's novel Atonement and the British director Joe Wright's adaptation of Atonement concentrates on the interpretive possibilities that arise from McEwan and Wright's projects of combining 2 kinds of narratives. One that possesses a strong forward impetus that invites the reader or viewer to accept the terms of the illusion of fiction, and one that presents the reader or viewer with a self-reflective narrative that, by questioning its own processes, stimulates ethical reflection on the use and abuse of stories. Then, in the last part of my chapter, I try to argue that, although by no means identical, ethical questions are also asked through the discourse of the Austrian director Michael Haneke's film Amour. Colin Davis has noted that ethics, quote, is a place where the contest over values takes place, not where it is resolved. The narrative ethics of McEwan's Atonement supports Davis' important point. Yet, although the novel's contest over values isn't resolved, Some values are supported while others are not, and I try to discuss some examples in my chapter. An illustrative instance of a prolonged ethical gaze, Hanneke's Amour also explores the interplay of experience and interpretation. For George, the film's main character, this process of constant narrative reinterpretation is as necessary as it is painful, because it's prompted by the deterioration of his wife's health after her first stroke, and then more strokes as the film progresses. Thus, two different narrative processes are intertwined, that of Anne's decline and that of George's interpretations and reinterpretations of their relationship as he attempts to nurse her. I conclude my chapter by noting that although the elements of interpretation and reinterpretation in the narrative do not show me as a reader or viewer how to interpret that narrative, they offer important guidelines. They also demonstrate, and this is important for me, that my interpretation is historical in one specific sense. Limited to my perspective, it is colored by my situation, my knowledge, my experience, and not least by my memory, particularly aspects of memory that are activated by the interpretive elements of the narrative that I'm reading or watching as part of my own life narrative. Thank you.
Hi, am I okay now, Mark?
You are good. You and Kaylee are on.
Okay, terrific. So in our chapter, The Hermeneutics of Darkness, Understanding Perpetrators on Their Crimes, my students at the American University of Paris, Kaylee Altamore, who's here with us and will speak after me, and Genevieve Bouget and I attempt to think through some of the problems of understanding perpetrators of genocide. How can we, or should we, understand others so radically different from ourselves? The actions of perpetrators feel a great distance from the comfort of our everyday lives, and it's difficult to fathom the depth of their cruelty and callousness. Also, they might not be willing or able to claim responsibility for their actions. Lying and concealment are always possible. We ask, what should the stance of the interpreter be, interpreting others so different from ourselves? In this light, Paul Ricoeur's distinction between a hermeneutics of suspicion or demystification and a hermeneutics of faithfulness or restoration is a productive point of departure. Although perpetrators would seem to call for hermeneutics of suspicion, provocatively, we argue for the necessity of restoration. Of course, there is warrant for both stances, but there is much to learn from a restorative stance, which understands perpetrators from their perspective, placing their words within a point of view and a set of meanings or horizon, as Gadamer has described. And our analysis is grounded in a reading of Gita Sereni's Into That Darkness, an examination of conscience, and her investigation of Franz Stengel, Commandant of Treblinka, and his role in the murder of the disabled and Jews during the Shoah.
As Brian was saying, rather than believing that perpetrators are too different from us, our work questions the ways in which interpretation may be short-sighted or skewed when we choose not to recognize our own situatedness in space and time. What insight do we forgo by allowing our own moral worlds to cloud our understanding of otherness? Through the work of Schrader and colleagues, we acknowledge the ways in which certain systems of morality, what they call the ethics of autonomy, community, and divinity, are different depending on the context at hand. Genocides and other atrocities are complex phenomena, group crimes that require the construction of cultural models, alternate moral universes through which one comes to understand what is good or right, what is just, and what needs to be done. horizons of meaning that have to be restored in order to understand what perpetrators believed and the meanings that scaffolded their crimes. Perpetrators like Stengel cannot be understood without us seeing them as moral actors and understanding their words as meaningful expressions of their subjective motivations. We argue that the interpretation of perpetrators of atrocity crimes requires us to recontextualize their actions and motivations within their own moral universes, and that this can be a powerful asset in the toolkit of the hermeneutics of restoration. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. I think Roger,
Okay.
You're next.
You can hear me? So thank you for the invitation, both to Mark and Hannah, to contribute to the book and to be able to describe briefly here. Irene, if you could perhaps just tell me when I reach 3 minutes, that would be really helpful. Thanks. My chapter is called Perpetrator Histories, Silencing and Untold Stories, A View from Contemporary Psychoanalysis. What interests me, both as a historian and philosopher, as well as a practicing psychoanalyst, is the way in which we are receptive to particular kinds of narratives and what makes us so. And in this case, I use psychoanalysis as a discipline to help us understand the process of development and the ways in which a particular kind of narrative meshes with the stories that we have grown up with. And I begin actually, though, with an example from the neurologist Oliver Sacks, in which he describes a group of aphasiacs who are watching a speech by then President Ronald Reagan. These aphasiacs are unable to communicate in any way that we normally do. And yet they all suddenly burst into laughter because they are able to sense when President Reagan is essentially lying in a way that most of us cannot. And I think this is a really important example of the way in which we struggle as a result of our development, as a result of the way we are shaped by society and primarily by family to grasp truths and untruths in narratives, and why we are particularly receptive to certain kinds of narratives, even though they may to others be obviously and patently false. I then turn to the role that psychoanalysis plays in helping us to disclose meaning. And I present a view of psychoanalysis not as a traditional form of understanding truths that might be hidden in the mind and unlocked, but rather through a process of empathic dialogue that two people might together come to understand the meanings inherent in stories, both the stories we tell in the present about our lives, but also the stories that have shaped us in the process of growing up. And then I draw in the final part of the chapter on two examples of individuals who grew up in perpetrator societies and were shaped by essentially perpetrator narratives to show the way that it becomes possible for these individuals to be particularly shaped by narratives that hide the experience of others who've been marginalized and who have been victims of violence. I use in particular the example in the southern United States of the way that today history is being legislated by Republican state-run governments, and the ways in which oftentimes individuals who have grown up in those particular areas who are members of the majority, in this case, the white majority, are themselves already shaped by the stories of their families that make them receptive to these broader narratives. And that sort of brings me to the end. So let me stop there and pass the baton on to the next person. Thank you.
And that person is Danielle.
Thank you. Once upon a time, there was a powerful enclave that was settled and built. It was the fortress of Western medicine. And it was dedicated and continues to be dedicated to the advancement of medical knowledge and the care of the sick. And in service of this goal, it built around the fortress these very tall and thick walls. It created its own set of languages. It created very strong barriers to entry, having to master this language and make sacrifices in order to enter the profession. Yet, as many critics have pointed out, this wall has threatened to irrevocably sever the practices of Western medicine from its humanistic substrate, the common soil subtending both the land under the fortress and the encircling lands, which is to say, all of humanity. And toward the close of the 20th century, a small but impassioned group gathered on either side of the gates, and they sang to the city's inhabitants, doctors, here we have a gift for you. It's a book, and inside you'll see stories. And the promise here is that this will be an efficacious clinical methodology, because better readers make better doctors. And so the gates creaked open and the book was allowed inside. So the narrative medicine as a field offers this promise that so-called narrative competence, in the words of the progenitor of the field, Rita Sharon, will be a useful clinical skill, and emphasizing the intrinsically narrative nature of healthcare. And what I argue in the chapter is that I hope that this is true, and also at the same time that the book entering the gates is to forgive the mixed metaphor, a Trojan horse book. For once narrative enters, then inevitably with it comes interpretation, with it comes hermeneutics. I'm echoing what Jens was saying earlier, that narrative can be viewed as a hermeneutic endeavor, which brings with it existential entanglement, and we should welcome this as existential entanglement. And so part of the utility of narrative medicine, of thinking about narrative and hermeneutics in relation to healthcare, to me, as I argue in the chapter, is that it evinces this tension between narrative skill as demonstrated mastery and the open-ended uncertainty, which is intrinsic to contemporary hermeneutical approach. Here, the framing of Gadamer, which a number of my colleagues have also been utilizing, is quite helpful in terms of the difference between a kind of an empirically verifiable truth that we might seek in the sciences and the kind of truth that can be experienced through, for example, works of art. And in narrative medicine, we use works of art. We do close reading of, for example, literary texts. And when a group of people sits together and reads a poem, then the questions that are raised by interpretation evince this kind of hermeneutical approach, because questions such as, well, where's the locus of meaning here? You know, is it in the author's intention? Is it in the cultural, historical context? Is it in the reader's interpretation, the group's interpretation, the collective interpretation that arises? And ultimately, this is subversive, just like the Trojan horse book, because it comes back into the fortress, into the clinical fortress. Because once we start asking these questions, then we can also ask them of things such as diagnosis. So it's not to negate a biomedical reality, but it's to put it in conversation with other aspects of our realities. So in the chapter, I explore a number of ways in which this kind of hermeneutic awareness, as Hannah puts it helpfully, contributes to narrative agency, which is another theme that she and I are both very interested in, and to empower not just doctors to be the readers, but all of us to be the readers and writers and interpreters, and to ask how we can engage in a truly collaborative and reciprocal process, you know, clinicians and people who are in the role of patient as well. To also, you know, to fruitfully question these roles of reader and writer and interpreter, and to continue this as an open-ended process of questioning fruitfully. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brad. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danielle. And thank you to Mark and Hannah for organizing the book and getting us together here with the conference, and the conference for having us. I come at this dual identity, both a humanities professor and a practicing psychiatrist, and I'm sort of interested in how can we bring these worlds together more effectively. And my chapter is a staging of material from 3 books, Edward Standicat's short story, Sunrise, Sunset, the latest edition of the introductory textbook of psychiatry, which you would be handed if you were in medical school, and my own book called Narrative Psychiatry, where I try to bring narrative, hermeneutics, continental philosophy more broadly together with the practice of psychiatry. And so in the short story, we have an immigrant family from Haiti, 1st, 2nd, 3rd generation, and they're all dealing with mental and physical difference of different kinds. And one of the things that's fascinating, one of the reasons I love literary fiction, is they have a multiplicity of possible meanings. Is it the body? Is it the brain? Is it cognitive distortions? Is it loss? Is it grief? Is it gender roles? Is it sexism? Is it colonial legacy? Is it religion? All at play. Is it willpower? And then I imagine a consultation with a psychiatrist who has a mononarrative. If you read their textbook, clinical world is actually quite diverse in the kinds of narratives they tell, but the textbook of psychiatry is quite mono. It's a world of broken brains, chemical imbalances, medications. And then I imagine a 3rd encounter where one of the characters from the story is unsure about the diagnosis and comes to meet a narrative psychiatrist, and with the narrative psychiatrist, as the story goes, they get a chance to have a dialogue about these different possible ways of meaning, these different possible combinations. How much do you want to think in terms of chemicals and medications, or grief, or sexism, or religion, or willpower? And who gets to decide? Obviously, in this story, the person whose life is most at stake. And then I spend a little bit of time just pulling back and asking, if we wanted to grow more people that could do that kind of helping people think through these complexities, set up conversations like that, how could we begin to set up communities in the academy that would do that? And there, medical humanities is an example, mental health humanities, psychological humanities, disability studies, increasingly MAD studies. One of the things that I like about them is, at least in my mind, they don't require the narrative to be the superior narrative of narrative is still a narrative. And so like, you don't have to have a top-down decision that all of psychiatry should be narrative. You just have to create a world for those who would like that, can get together and build it and grow it and develop it, so that we have a world where that possibility exists, as opposed to a world where that possibility is marginalized. And I think I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Hannah, do you have any closing words you want to say since you opened?
Not really. I really enjoyed all the brief talks. So thank you so much to all the speakers. And it's great that we have time for discussion. So I think it would be really great to have questions and comments now. And who would like to moderate that part? We didn't really discuss that.
I think Irena was elected.
I can. I'm happy to help with that one. Thank you so much for everyone for these wonderful and very insightful short inputs, and also for being so mindful of time so that we actually have time for questions, comments, thoughts. Please type your question in the chat or use the hand raise tool. I will try to monitor both of those. If you would like to ask a short question or comment on one specific
brief talk or generally? While we are waiting for questions, I just take, no, Molly, go ahead, please.
It's not really a question. It's just something I think that, well, Mark alluded to it in the beginning and several other people pointed this as well. But I mean, although there's such a wide range of topics here, one of the things that I'm struck by is how pertinent these questions are in real lived political life, and right now, very much right now, with the Israel-Gaza conflict and the way in which it's being narrated. And I guess one of the things I wanted to say is that you know, it's really interesting. I sort of question, it's Mark, what you and I talked about in relation to COVID is like you could say, well, who cares? These are like interpretive questions. And yet if we stand back and if we ever wanted to know how important the work is, you only have to, you know, walk out your front door here in London or read the papers or whatever. And there's not really very many analyses which are looking at it explicitly from a narrative point of view, which is interesting to me because I think we actually have a lot to say here. Of course, you know, I'm not saying there's no position from nowhere, for sure. But I actually think that as narrative scholars who are interested in the use and abuse of stories, and you look at the ways in which certain kinds of tales are being mirrored and fed into this conflict, I think that, you know, I don't really have a question as much as to say, I think for me, listening to this range of topics and just living in these really, really dark days, I am reminded how important these questions are, far, far, far beyond any question of scholarship.
Yeah, if I can just briefly continue from that. Thank you so much for that discussion. And we were actually hoping a bit with Mark that maybe we can also discuss this issue of use and abuse of stories in the current context that we are now witnessing, because it seems to one of the things that strikes me is that often the other side is seen to use narratives, but not like as if it were not like both sides are using narratives very much, and for example weaponizing the Holocaust memory and things like that. So it really draws the situation now. We can see how the narratives we use now are not, they don't come from nowhere. We are sort of drawing on this whole narrative tradition, like which narratives are we activating and using and abusing. So, but I would really love to hear other comments on that now, because it seems also such a polarized situation that it's quite difficult also to engage in that kind of public discussion. But I don't know what we are situated in different countries as well, so it would be valuable to hear your experiences. Have you tried to engage in discussion about the narratives that, for example, Israel and Palestinians are using at the moment?
A very quick response. You know, there's another huge challenge, of course, that's embedded in the question that you asked, Hannah. And that is that people are often living in quite different narrative universes, so to speak. And it's not at all clear whether the kind of bridges that are so often called for can happen, because the narrative worlds often seem utterly incommensurable. And that, of course, is a tragic situation. But as Molly suggests, still very much worthy of our attention as narrative scholars and as citizens of the world. Brad, you were going to add something, and
yeah, I this came up in class the other day, and we were looking at a New York Times article which was talking about 1948, and it starts out by saying, the year 1948 has created two very different narratives between Israel and Palestine. And we need to know what those two narratives are. And of course, we need to know what really happened. And I thought it was really fascinating because a few years ago, I think they would have said two ideologies, like there was some logic of truth, false. And now they shift it to narrative. So in some ways, our work is not in vain, but in other ways, narrative is sort of working the same way. So we had an interesting sort of how narrative is becoming used now, but still sort of meaning ideology, how there is some sort of truth that the New York Times could tell us, that the other two couldn't tell us. And then, of course, as the class worked out so beautifully, there's a fourth narrative. Not only one side, second side, New York Times, but then the narrative of the class, there's a narrative of multiple narratives, right? So it's fascinating to see that being played out.
There's a question in the chat. Thank you for this instigating reflections. I'm wondering if someone would like to talk about the possibility of change of narratives.
Can I jump in? I'm not sure if I can answer the question directly, but it's also a follow-on to a number of things that we just mentioned. It seems that it's very important to bring to bear here how it is that we are receptive to particular kinds of narratives, right? On the one hand, there's a telling of the narrative and what the narrative says and the meaning that is inherent in it. On the other hand, there are those who listen and hear the narrative, and how it is with these competing narratives that we might only hear one versus the other. Right? And I think Mark sort of pointed to that a little bit in terms of the different narratives in which we live, the communities in which we live. But I think it also relates, of course, to the histories that we carry and to the histories of the communities in which we live and develop. And just to complicate it yet further.
I'll just add, I wish there was a simpler answer to the question of change. Here's what I see as a dilemma. At one point, I was imagining that one way of breaking through kind of seemingly impervious narratives had to do with presenting the human dimension in such kind of bald and vivid form that it could somehow break through the crust of whatever ideological position one might hold. The images of damaged people, of people who are being oppressed, whatever. But I think part of the problem there is that we've become somewhat benumbed to those images. And it's not even clear at this point what it is that can, in a sense, help people break loose from their commitments and their positions. And so, this to me is one of the biggest challenges, at least of some of the work I'm doing. And I will just be candid in saying, I'm not sure how best to handle it. Georgia, you were going to add something?
I was just going to say that a lot of us in our presentations have pointed to dialogue, and particularly the importance of dialogue with people that have different views and come from different perspectives. And I really don't see any other way of changing narratives I guess you could kill the people that have the narrative you don't like, but other than dialogue, conversation, talking to other people and taking their views seriously, even if in the end you disagree with them, I don't see any other way of doing it.
Thank you. Can I just quickly add that I completely agree, and I think here also that kind of hermeneutic awareness that is kind of precondition for dialogue, that we have to acknowledge that we are also interpreting the world and we also have narratives, because often the problem why it's not a genuine dialogue is that if one partner of dialogue thinks that he or she has just like direct access to how reality really is, and only the other person is telling narratives, for example, or interpreting the world and so on. So I think it's important to acknowledge that we are all engaging in narrative interpretation, and then we can discuss what kind of narratives we are trying to become aware of, the narratives we are using, because even if we are, no matter how self-reflexive, we can't be transparent to ourselves, and there's always something that we just take for granted. And this is also something that Gadamer very nicely reflects on, how our self-understanding is always incomplete, and that kind of humility is quite important starting point for genuine dialogue. I think Brian had something. Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to argue with the notion of dialogue. I mean, I think that dialogue in an ideal world, it does. This is the answer that that we mostly come up with. I think it is this idea that we, in some ways, that we're going to get to understand. This goes back, in fact, to like Gordon Allport and contact theory. You can find the same notions, of course, in Gadamer. That there's some way that dialogue is going to produce kind of greater, deeper understanding and change. And I don't know if it does, that would be great. I'd be very happy with that. I think if it does, it probably is an extraordinarily long process, not just one encounter, but multiple encounters over many, many years. And I think that's probably something to think about as well too. I think that there's other ways of instigating change that don't require that might not require kind of self-process and self-awareness and propaganda being one of them. Potentially it may not be the right kind of change that we're looking for, but it definitely is one of even in a Trumpian fashion, of repeating the same thing over and over and over again, no matter how outrageous that it is. Maybe it's not the right kind of change, but that's also too, I think, a way of achieving some sorts of change.
I would like to briefly bring a couple of voices from the audience here. Lisa saying, getting people to move out of cults gradually is or could serve as a model for this issue of how to move narrative towards change and move their positions. And Cynthia saying, thank you, all your perspectives are fascinating. I have many thoughts as I think about my community and African-American culture. I would love to reimagine how we train the next generation of doctors and clinical psychologists at Howard University and Howard University Hospital. My own work focused on narrative personality psychology can be enhanced by immersing myself in the chapters in this book. I look forward to reading and engaging with everyone moving forward. And Molly posted a book edited by Israelis and Palestinians as a really wonderful narrative-oriented offering, looking at the different narrations of 1948 and after through an examination of contrasting documents. There is a link in the chat if you would like to look this up. And Elizabeth is saying, I guess I also wonder if you think change in narrative involves pain, and whether this is necessarily the case.
Generally speaking, yes. But others may have significant things to say. I'll be leaving.
It's the logic of grief, loss of narrative, acceptance of another one. The logic of grief of letting go and reattaching would be a narrative of pain.
I don't know if pain to me means a lot of different things. I think that one of the reasons it's so challenging is it really necessitates a whole cognitive reframing Okay. And when you ask somebody to think differently or to open themselves to thinking differently about something that they have thought about for a long, long time, perhaps their whole lives, it's very hard to do that, because it's not only hard for others to do it, it's hard for everyone, for us to do that too. And it's like a reframing. So we actually, I think, have a pretty strong resistance to wanting to do that, because we have so much invested in the way we have framed it, because that forms our stability in a way. And so I think that there are just so many things, so many mitigating factors against which, you know, which would make us less inclined to really start to try to think about things differently. Now, I do think, and not to limit it to the horror of the last, 3 weeks, but I do think that some of the scenes that we have seen are so shocking that it has caused even stable ground to become destabilized for many people who had thought, who had seen a certainty in the way they saw things before. I was here in London. I was at this march on Saturday. 300,000 people. I think that not a lot of Jewish people would have before thought that they would go on what was, this pro-Palestinian march. But in fact, many, many, many Jews were there, okay? Because in fact, what is at risk not to stand up is so much greater than being invested in a particular way of framing this thing. And there were whole contingents of people who were, coalitions of people who wouldn't normally have been there. So I think for me, it's the question isn't whether or not it's painful. It's that we're so disinclined to do it because we're so invested otherwise. Yeah. I see Colin has his hand up.
Yes, please, Colin.
Sorry, did someone say Colin?
You had your hand up.
No, I didn't. Oh, I may have, but it was by accident.
Okay.
Beg your pardon.
Perhaps I can add to what Molly said, and I thought what you just shared was very important. And I think the question, of course, is why are we so invested in particular narratives? Right? What do those narratives provide us? And there it can become, on the one hand, obviously it has social meaning, but it can also have tremendously powerful personal meaning. And the difficulty of shifting those narratives can be huge, right? And what's involved in that process, both at a social level and a collective level, but also at a personal level.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. It also reminded me when you said earlier that those stories have shaped us in our lives. And I think this is very important and very self-relevant, like stories that have shaped us in our lives. So I like this idea of thinking of it as grief to lose those stories or give up parts of those stories, maybe. Yeah.
It's also not just about giving up stories about things and having an investment in it. It's also, changing our stories involves a giving up of, at least a part of our sense of who we are, and that is very difficult. I can change my story about politics relatively easy. But the impact of, well, what does that say about me and how I perceive myself, I would find much more difficult and much more painful.
And that seems to be at stake also now in
Israel and Palestine, that this question of identity, that it seems that it's difficult for many people to let go of those narratives because it's so central to who they are. But it also seems to me relevant, this kind of grief perspective, that maybe that kind of grief work should be done to avoid further violence and further war crimes and so on. But I was wondering if you, Molly, have some ideas on what would be the kind of way forward from a kind of narrative perspective. You were saying that narrative scholars should contribute to this discussion more, and so what's your sort of perspective on that?
I do think, and lots of us have talked before about this in relation to other political crises, although this one just seems even more horrendous than other things we were facing. But I think that there are very real things which narrative scholars can contribute, okay? And the questions that we normally ask of our scholarship, to try to create a platform where we're also asking them of our lives, because we're being told, okay? I'm being told what Jews feel, for instance. There was a wonderful article in the New York Times the other day, and it quoted our friend, colleague, narrative scholar, Michelle Fine. And Michelle says, she says, I'm part of the Jewish community too, okay? And in other words, what's being rolled out of the American Jewish opinion is actually not her opinion as a Jew as well, okay? These aren't only personal questions of hers. These are actually questions of Georgia. I think it's very much to do with the questions that Georgia was raising earlier. Who gets to say what about whom? And by the way, am I allowed to name my own position? So the moment that you actually interrogate not only our own scholarship, but in fact our lives, as I said, I think then a lot more things become, to put it in a crude way, but up for grabs. Okay. I've heard lots of people recently say, and I find it hard to believe, but I do believe that, I never knew the term Nakba. How did you not know the term? But you don't, not to be judgmental about that, but then you think, well, okay, that we need to be part of making a world where this is not have you heard the term Holocaust before? I mean, we need to be part of creating this dialogue, this space, and not to be thinking that we are reading off positions just because we think we know who, what characteristics somebody has. So I'm wondering a bit there. That might not be saying a very concrete thing, but I think that the questions that we would ordinarily ask of our work as rigorous scholars are that much more important to ask in this current moment. And I think it's something that Mark and I tried to argue in the piece that we wrote together about COVID, saying, this is not the time where our work is on the side. Or Trump, we saw this again, there were lots of very good pieces about Trump from a narrative perspective as well. But that these questions, they are really important in ways which only become more so. And so I think that trying to, several people have been mentioning about what they've been doing in their classrooms. Jens has just been describing his classroom, and I think that we need to break into as many forms as we can to have dialogue, to have conversation, and to think about what our own blind spots are, and our own investments in our own particular positionings. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hannah, would you like to add anything to that at this point?
No, I think it was just really great that we could also actually reflect together on the situation right now. And I think it also, this situation shows the kind of certain dangers of narratives that if we think of, for example, this kind of universal narrative of good versus evil is not helping. So instead, that's how narratives can blind us from kind of complexity of all these historical developments that have led here. So that's also something I've been thinking about in Finland. In the media, there's very much this kind of, at least the initial narrative was very much this kind of universal evil versus good. Like, wasn't that what Joe Biden was also saying, this radical evil that Hamas is representing? So it activates this kind of universal, almost like fairy tale type of narrative. But anyway, I think there were really, really valuable points made by Manny. So thank you.
Thank you so much. We have arrived at the end of our today's event. Unfortunately, I think we could still spend a lot of time discussing. So thank you all once again for being part of this roundtable today. I hope that we do continue our discussions in various forms, maybe in events of SQIP and the Association of Narrative Research and Practice. Please be also on the lookout for our call for papers for our 2024 SQIP conference in June at Boston College shortly. Discussions in our qualitative psychology journal, and maybe as part of our new SQIP webpage that went online just 2 days ago. Thank you so much again, and have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you, Reina.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.